President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are scheduled to hold a phone call this morning. It will be the first known conversation between the two leaders since Ukraine agreed to a month-long ceasefire in its war with Russia. Russia has not agreed, though President Trump is expected to make that case on today's call. Joining us now, Meghan O'Sullivan, director of Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. She has served in both Democrat and Republican administrations, including as Deputy National Security Advisor in the George W. Bush administration. It's good to see you, Meghan. I got a little bit. Good morning. I got a little bit, I don't know, pessimistic with some of your comments because we know that Vladimir Putin, number one, is very shrewd, and he's focused on something, and that, I guess that's the issue, and you can tell us what that is. It's going to be a chess match, and Trump, President Trump, his supporters would say he's a great negotiator and deal maker, and he certainly wants to get something done, but Putin has a lot of cards as well that might be in his favor. I think that's what your point is.
I think you're exactly right, Joe. We have to keep in mind as we look to this phone call this morning that we all believe will be consequential, that Putin and Trump do not have the same objectives in this phone call. Trump is very, very focused on ending the war, ending the violence, and doing so in very short order. And so he'll be kind of interested in the broad outcome of the call more than any details. Putin, on the other hand, has very different objectives. He's not interested in a quick end. And in fact, he's doing comparatively well on the battlefield. So a quick end and an immediate ceasefire isn't really in his interests. What he would like to see, the better outcome, is a reflection of the fact that for President Putin, this call is not just about Ukraine. It's about his larger agenda vis-a-vis the Europeans. And so if the outcome of a call is something that divides the transatlantic relationship, divides the U.S., Ukraine, and the Europeans, this is a win for President Putin. So what does that mean in terms of what could happen in this call? It's easy to imagine that President Trump could end up agreeing to some of the preconditions that Putin is likely to pose, and that Trump could go back to the Ukrainians and the Europeans and say, look, we have a deal. We have an unconditional ceasefire. There are these details that I've agreed to. And this would once again, after coming together in the last week, it would divide the Europeans, the Ukrainians, and the Americans. This is a win-win for Putin if it unfolds in this manner. The more I've watched everything happen, I have, and many people have become convinced that we probably are not going to see an outright victory for Ukraine, and anything that we finally, any resolution to this is going to involve. Obviously, a lot of that land is not going back to Ukraine at this point. But, I mean, in your view, you think it's possible that Putin could demand enough to where Ukraine says no, and then, once again, there's another wedge. Ukraine already created a wedge somewhat with or at least a wedge was the end result of what happened with the Oval Office meeting between the United States and Europe. You're exactly right, Joe. There's a big wedge coming out of that Oval Office meeting, but the Ukrainians did quite a good job patching that up in the last week or 10 days alongside the French and the British, that President Trump and his administration feels like they're back on the same page with the Ukrainians and the Europeans. And this is all good. And it's partially a reflection that Volodymyr Zelensky, he agreed to a ceasefire for 30 days without any preconditions. He said yes, and that is what President Trump was looking for. This shifted the attention to Putin and whether or not he'll say yes to an unconditional 30-day ceasefire. And Putin, as you suggested, is very clever, very well-versed in manipulating situations, has been able to convince multiple presidents across multiple administrations that there's something more from having a good relationship with Russia. And again, I think his intention going into
into this is to try to keep Trump on his side, but, to try to emerge not just with an agreement for an unconditional ceasefire, but having had the Americans make certain concessions up front that make it very difficult for Ukraine or the Europeans, or alternatively put him in a far superior position when these negotiations do happen. So I do feel that we can look forward to seeing some kind of negotiation in this calendar year. Whether or not it meets President Trump's desired timeline, which is today, now, immediately, I think is really open to question.
If it is perceived that Ukraine got the short end of the stick, or that Putin was able to assert his will and get a lot of things. But it did result in an end to the war. Would that be a win at that point? Because you said it's a win-win for Putin. That sounds like a lose-lose for Ukraine and the West. Is it possible for this to have a favorable outcome at all if it ends the fighting?
When I said a win-win for Putin, what I meant is the outcome of today's call. Either there are a variety of outcomes. I mean, one possibility is that Putin is not forthcoming and that Trump leaves the call annoyed and threatening more economic and other kinds of pressure on Putin. That's certainly plausible. A win-win for Putin would be if President Trump decided, he'll make a few concessions here or there to get Putin to the table, and either Putin begins with those concessions at the negotiations, or he splits the Europeans, Ukrainians, and Americans again. In terms of the broader outcome of the war, it's certainly the case that ending this war is going to be in everybody's interest. And what really matters, and whether or not this ends up being a good thing for the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the transatlantic relation versus simply a good thing for Russians, has to do with the specifics of the deal, particularly around three things that the Ukrainians care most about: territory, their ability at some point in the future to join organizations like the EU and NATO, and finally, whether or not the Ukrainians have any limitation on their ability to build their munitions, their military, and their army. Those three things the Ukrainians have said are red lines. They're clearly also the things that Putin is focused on and trying to erode Ukrainian advantage in any of those arenas. And those are the things that are going to be on the table, and those are the things that are going to determine whether whatever outcome of these peace talks reveals, whether or not this is going to be not just a short-term gain for those who no longer are fighting on the battlefield, but a medium and long-term advantage for not just Ukraine, but Europe as a whole.